December 17th, 1944, 7:15 a.m. Krinkelt, Rocherath, Belgium. The morning fog lay thick across the Ardennes, turning the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath into a maze of gray stone buildings and frozen mud streets. Private First Class William Soderman crouched in a doorway on the eastern edge of Rocherath, his hands wrapped around a weapon that most soldiers considered barely adequate against light armor, let alone what was coming through that fog. The M1A1 Bazooka in his grip weighed just 13 pounds. The tanks rolling toward his position weighed 45 tons. Some weighed 70. The temperature hovered just above freezing. Breath condensed in white clouds. Somewhere in the fog, tank engines growled, a deep mechanical rumble that vibrated through the frozen ground. Soderman had heard that sound before. Every infantryman in the 2nd Infantry Division had heard it by now. It was the sound of German armor, and there was a lot of it coming. What made the next 48 hours remarkable wasn't just that American infantry would stop a panzer division with handheld rockets. It was that they'd do it by violating every tactical principle the weapon was designed around, taking shots that training manuals explicitly warned against, and somehow making those impossible shots work. The Battle of Krinkelt-Rocherath would see bazooka teams destroy or disable dozens of German tanks, many of them by hitting weak points that gunners had mere seconds to identify before being crushed or incinerated. It was desperation made tactical, stupidity that somehow worked, and one of the most intense tank versus infantry actions of the entire war. But first, you need to understand what was actually happening in the Ardennes that morning, because without context, what these men did looks less like tactics and more like suicide. 3 days earlier, on December 16, 1944, Germany had launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, what Allied forces would call the Battle of the Bulge. Along an 85-mile front in the Ardennes forest, 3 German armies comprising over 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks had smashed into American positions held by just 4 divisions. The objective was ambitious to the point of fantasy: break through Allied lines, capture the port of Antwerp, split British and American forces, and force a negotiated peace in the West. Adolf Hitler had staked everything on this offensive. It was Germany's last operational reserve, last major fuel stockpile, last chance to avoid total defeat. The 2nd Infantry Division, a veteran unit that had fought from Normandy through France, held positions in the northern shoulder of the German attack. These men weren't green replacements. They'd seen combat, understood their weapons, knew how to fight. On December 16th, they'd been preparing for their own attack toward the Roer river dams. Then the German offensive hit, and within hours the entire situation reversed. Instead of attacking, the 2nd Infantry Division found itself conducting a fighting withdrawal, trying to establish a defensive line that could anchor the northern flank and prevent German panzers from exploiting the breakthrough. The twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath sat on high ground controlling the road network leading west toward the Elsenborn Ridge. If German armor captured these villages and broke through to Elsenborn, the entire northern sector of the American line would collapse. The road to the Meuse River, and possibly Antwerp, would be open. So, the 2nd Infantry Division was ordered to hold Krinkelt-Rocherath long enough for other units to establish defenses on the ridge behind them. How long was long enough remained unclear. Long enough for thousands of men to withdraw. Long enough to save an entire sector of the front. Long enough, probably, to die doing it. Facing them was the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth, a fanatical formation with extensive combat experience and better equipment than most Wehrmacht units still possessed. The 12th SS had Panthers, Mark IVs, and supporting infantry. More concerning elements of other SS Panzer divisions in the area included King Tigers, 70-ton behemoths with 180 mm of frontal armor and an 88 mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 miles. The King Tiger was the heaviest, most powerfully armed and armored tank to see operational service in World War II. Its frontal armor was effectively impenetrable to every American tank gun deployed in theater. Against this, American infantry had M1 rifles, .30 caliber machine guns, 57 mm anti-tank guns that were already obsolete, a handful of Sherman tanks, and bazookas. The bazooka, officially the M1A1 rocket launcher, was a smoothbore tube that fired a 2.36-inch rocket with a shaped charge warhead. In theory, this warhead could penetrate about 4 inches of armor plate at 90 degrees. In practice, battlefield conditions were never ideal. The rocket motor burned for only a fraction of a second, giving the projectile a velocity of just 265 feet per second, slow enough that you could track it in flight on a clear day. Effective range was listed as 300 yards. Practical range against moving armor was more like 100 yards or less. The weapon required a 2-man team, one soldier to aim and fire, another to load and scan for threats. It produced a massive backblast that revealed your position instantly, and it was never, ever designed to engage heavy tanks frontally. Training doctrine was explicit. Bazookas were for hitting light armor, vehicles, fortifications, and, if absolutely necessary, medium tanks from the side or rear. Attempting to engage a 45-ton Panther from the front was considered marginally suicidal. Attempting to engage a 70-ton King Tiger from any angle was considered completely suicidal. The shaped charge warhead simply lacked the penetration to defeat that much armor at those angles. Yet over the next 2 days, American infantrymen in crinkled Rocherath would do exactly that, repeatedly, because they had no other choice. By the morning of December 17th, German forces had pushed American units out of their forward positions. The 2nd Infantry Division's 9th and 38th Infantry Regiments were falling back through crinkled Rocherath, establishing hasty defensive positions in the villages while covering the withdrawal of other units. The plan, such as it was, involved holding the villages long enough to establish a coherent line on Elsenborn Ridge. No one knew exactly how long that would take. What everyone knew was that German armor was coming, and there wasn't much to stop it with except rifles, guts, and those inadequate tubes of aluminum and sheet metal called bazookas. The first German tanks appeared through the fog around mid-morning on December 17th. They came down the main road from the east, Panthers mostly, advancing with infantry support but not enough of it, and not deployed properly. This was the first critical German mistake. Panzer doctrine emphasized combined arms, tanks supporting infantry protecting tanks, both working together to reduce strong points. But the 12th SS Panzer Division was under pressure to break through quickly, to maintain the offensive momentum that Operation Wacht am Rhein required. Speed was prioritized over caution. So the Panthers charged down the main street of Rocherath in column formation, a tactic that might have worked against a demoralized or unprepared enemy, but was disastrously vulnerable against determined infantry in built-up terrain. William Soderman watched the 1st Panther approach his position. The tank commander likely couldn't see much through the fog and narrow vision slits, just gray buildings, rubble, occasional muzzle flashes from rifle fire that pinged harmlessly off the armor. What the tank commander couldn't see were the bazooka teams positioned in upper-story windows, in doorways, behind low walls, anywhere that offered a clear shot at the tank's flanks or rear as it passed. This was urban combat at its most primitive and brutal. The Germans had the armor and firepower. The Americans had intimate knowledge of the terrain they'd just occupied and the willingness to let enemy tanks roll past them before firing at the vulnerable points. Soderman's position gave him a side angle on the lead Panther. The tank was perhaps 70 yards away, moving slowly through the narrow street, main gun traversing left and right as the crew searched for targets. At 70 yards, a bazooka rocket took roughly half a second to reach the target. Not much time for the tank to react, but enough time for the rocket to drift if wind caught it wrong, or for your aim to be off, or for the shaped charged jet to fail to penetrate if it struck at a poor angle. Soderman braced the tube against his shoulder, sighted through the simple iron sights, and aimed for the Panther's side armor at the rear, where the engine compartment was, where armor was thinner, where a penetrating hit might disable the tank or start a fire. He fired. The back blast vented into the building behind him, filling the space with acrid smoke. The rocket, streaked across the 70 yards in less than a second, struck the Panther's side armor just behind the turret and detonated. The shaped charge warhead focused explosive energy into a jet of superheated metal, traveling at thousands of feet per second. When functioning correctly, this jet could burn through armor plate and spray molten metal and explosive gases into the crew compartment. Whether Soderman's shot penetrated the armor completely or just damaged the engine is unclear from the records. What's clear is that the Panther stopped moving. Smoke began pouring from the engine deck. The crew bailed out through the hatches and scattered into buildings, where American riflemen engaged them. One tank down. But there were more behind it, and now they knew where the bazooka fire had come from. The second Panther in the column traversed its turret toward Soderman's position and fired an HE round into the building. The explosion collapsed part of the upper floor and filled the street with dust and debris. Soderman relocated. Standard bazooka team doctrine, which every soldier learned early: shoot and move, because staying in place after revealing your position was a fast way to die. Across Rocherath, other bazooka teams were engaging other tanks. The Germans had pushed multiple Panthers into the village, supported by infantry in the buildings, and the fighting quickly devolved into close-quarters chaos. Tank main guns fired into structures at point-blank range, collapsing walls and burying defenders. German infantry cleared buildings room by room. American riflemen and machine gunners held stairwells and strongpoints, making the Germans pay for every yard. And bazooka teams, moving through rubble, using alleyways and back doors, exploiting every angle that offered a shot at tank flanks or rear, continued firing at targets that doctrine said they shouldn't engage at all. The M1A1 bazooka's two-man crew drill required coordination under conditions that made coordination nearly impossible. The gunner carried the launcher tube in a bag containing 2 or 3 rockets. The assistant gunner carried additional rockets and helped load, spot targets, and watch for threats while the gunner focused on aiming. Loading involved inserting the rocket into the rear of the tube, connecting the electrical firing wire to terminals on the launcher, tapping the gunner's shoulder to signal "ready," and then stepping clear of the backblast zone. The gunner checked that the arming wire had pulled free. If it hadn't, the rocket wouldn't detonate, and aimed through iron sights that provided no magnification and required estimating range by eye. Trigger pull sent electrical current to the rocket motor, which ignited and propelled the rocket out of the tube with enough velocity to arm the warhead's impact fuse after about 30 feet of flight. The entire process took trained teams about 15 seconds from firing one rocket to being ready to fire the next. In combat, with tanks shooting back, that 15 seconds felt much longer. Lieutenant Jesse Morrow, commanding a platoon from the 38th Infantry Regiment, found himself pinned down near his command post when a Tiger tank, possibly a Tiger I or the even heavier King Tiger, reports differ, rolled into view and began systematically destroying American positions. The Tiger's 88mm gun fired round after round into buildings where American troops had taken cover, collapsing structures and forcing survivors into the open where machine gun fire cut them down. Morrow's options were limited. His command post had no anti-tank weapons. Retreating meant crossing open ground under direct fire. Staying meant waiting to be killed. Then he saw it. A bazooka lying in the street next to a destroyed Jeep. The Jeep had taken a direct hit earlier in the day. Its crew was dead, but the bazooka appeared intact. Morrow ran into the street, grabbed the launcher tube, checked for rockets, found 2 in the bag, and took cover behind rubble with a clear view of the Tiger's rear quarter. The Tiger was perhaps 100 yards away, focused on targets to its front, unaware of the lieutenant behind it, with a weapon that had virtually no chance of penetrating its armor. What Lieutenant Morrow understood, either through training or battlefield improvisation, was that bazookas didn't need to penetrate armor to be effective. Even a non-penetrating hit could damage optics, tracks, external components, or force the crew to button up and reduce their situational awareness. And if you got lucky, if you hit the engine deck or rear armor at the right angle, if the shaped charged jet found a weak point or a seam, you might actually penetrate and disable the tank. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot available. Morrow loaded the bazooka with help from a nearby soldier, aimed at the Tiger's rear engine deck, and fired. The rocket struck the engine compartment and detonated. Smoke erupted from the Tiger's engine grills. The tank lurched forward, then stopped. Whether Morrow's shot actually penetrated the heavy rear armor or simply damaged the engine exhaust system is unknown. What matters is that the Tiger stopped firing, began smoking heavily, and its crew bailed out minutes later as the engine fire spread. One of the war's most feared tanks, knocked out by a weapon that wasn't supposed to be able to hurt it, fired by an infantry lieutenant who'd grabbed it from a dead man's Jeep. If you're still here, thank you. Please consider subscribing so more people can discover these stories from history. By early afternoon on December 17, the tactical situation in Krinkolt-Rocherath had become a confused close-quarters battle with no clear front lines. German tanks roamed the streets, often with inadequate infantry support. American infantry held buildings and strongpoints, often without anti-tank weapons heavier than bazookas. The result was a chaotic knife fight where both sides took severe casualties and neither could gain decisive advantage. The 2nd Infantry Division's after-action reports document that by the end of December 17th, bazooka teams had destroyed 21 German armored vehicles, tanks, assault guns, and half-tracks. Additional vehicles had been destroyed by the handful of 57mm anti-tank guns and towed 3-inch guns. That American crews managed to get into position and, by anti-tank mines, hastily laid in the streets. 27 more German vehicles were claimed destroyed by guns and mines that first day. The numbers are approximate. Battlefield accounting in urban combat is never precise, but the scale of the fighting is clear. The Germans, for their part, continued making tactical mistakes that multiplied American effectiveness. The decision to push armor down narrow village streets without overwhelming infantry support meant that tanks were exposed to close-range ambush. The pressure to maintain offensive momentum meant that tank commanders couldn't wait for infantry to clear buildings before advancing. And the fog and close terrain meant that German armor's greatest advantages, long-range gunnery and thick frontal armor, were negated. In the streets of Rocherath, a Panther tank with a 75mm gun effective to 2,000 yards was reduced to fighting at ranges under 100 yards, where even a bazooka became dangerous. What none of the Americans knew during that first day of fighting was that the German offensive's entire northern shoulder depended on breaking through Krinkolt-Rocherath. If the 2nd Infantry Division could hold these villages even temporarily, it would buy time for the 99th Infantry Division and other units to establish defenses on Elsenborn Ridge. If those defenses held, the northern route toward the Meuse would be blocked, and the German offensive would be forced to narrow frontage in the center and south, where Allied reinforcements were already moving. The tactical actions of individual bazooka teams in Rocherath on December 17th were contributing to operational outcomes they couldn't see and strategic consequences that wouldn't become clear for weeks. William Soderman, the PFC with the Bazooka, encountered German armor 3 separate times that day. The second engagement came in the afternoon when a Panther appeared at a crossroads where American infantry were trying to establish a defensive position. The tank's appearance forced an immediate decision: engage or withdraw. Withdrawing meant abandoning the position and giving German armor freedom to maneuver. Engaging meant taking on a 45-ton tank with a weapon designed for much lighter targets. Soderman chose to engage. He positioned himself in an alley with a clear shot at the Panther's flank as it crossed the intersection, fired, and hit the tank in the side armor. The rocket detonated but didn't immediately disable the tank. The Panther completed its turn, bringing its main gun to bear on Soderman's position. Before the German crew could fire, Soderman's assistant gunner had already reloaded. Soderman fired a second rocket, hitting the Panther again in roughly the same location. This time, the shaped-charged jet found something critical, possibly the ammunition stowage, possibly the fuel tanks. The Panther exploded in a fireball that sent the turret 3 feet into the air before it crashed back onto the hull. The third engagement that day was the one that would earn Soderman the Medal of Honor, though he didn't know that at the time. By late afternoon, German pressure was forcing elements of the 2nd Infantry Division to begin withdrawing through crinkled Rocherath toward the Elsenborn Ridge. The withdrawal needed to be covered. Someone had to stay in contact with German forces, slow them down, prevent them from turning an orderly withdrawal into a rout. Soderman's unit was part of that covering force. When German tanks appeared advancing down the main road toward the withdrawing American column, Soderman again grabbed his bazooka. This time the target was a Panther leading a column of 3 tanks. The tactical situation was straightforward and terrible. If those tanks weren't stopped, they'd break through to the withdrawing infantry and turn retreat into massacre. The terrain offered no good cover, just an open road with shallow ditches on either side. Soderman moved to a position where he could engage the lead tank from an oblique angle, knowing that firing would reveal his position to all 3 Panthers and their supporting infantry. He waited until the lead Panther was within 80 yards, close enough that missing was unlikely, close enough that the tank's bow machine gun could kill him in seconds, and fired. The rocket hit the Panther's front glacis plate at an angle, detonated, and penetrated the armor. The tank stopped moving immediately. Fire erupted from the crew compartment hatches. The 2nd and 3rd Panthers in column immediately opened fire on Soderman's position. High explosive and machine gun rounds tore up the ground around him. He relocated, running bent over through the shallow ditch, while German infantry advanced toward his last position. His assistant gunner had been wounded in the initial return fire, so Soderman was alone now with 1 rocket remaining. The 2nd Panther advanced past the burning wreck of the lead tank and continued toward the American position. Soderman loaded his last rocket, took aim, and fired at the Panther's flank as it passed his new position. The hit wasn't clean. The rocket struck at a shallow angle and the shaped-charged jet failed to penetrate completely, but it damaged the track and road wheels badly enough that the tank stopped. The crew began repairs, giving American infantry time to withdraw further. At this point, out of rockets and under heavy fire, Soderman attempted to withdraw as well. German infantry spotted him moving and opened fire. He was hit multiple times. Records indicate wounds to the arms and legs, severe enough to make further combat impossible. Other American soldiers retrieved him under fire and evacuated him to an aid station. His actions on December 17th, 3 separate engagements, multiple tanks destroyed or disabled, critical time bought for withdrawing infantry, would result in a Medal of Honor citation, though that wouldn't come until much later. For now, he was just another casualty in a battle that was consuming men and machines at a rate neither side could sustain indefinitely. As night fell on December 17, Krinkelt and Rocherath remained in American hands, but barely. The 9th and 38th Infantry Regiments had been mauled. German armor controlled sections of both villages. Buildings were burning. The streets were littered with destroyed vehicles, American and German both. And the 12th SS Panzer Division was preparing for a major assault the next morning, December 18th, that would either break through to Elsenborn or exhaust itself against American defenses. The night of December 17th to 18th was bitterly cold. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Soldiers on both sides tried to consolidate positions, evacuate wounded, and prepare for the next day's fighting. American engineers laid additional anti-tank mines in the streets and roads. Bazooka teams scrounged for ammunition, knowing they'd need every rocket they could find. Battalion and company commanders tried to establish some coherent defensive line in the chaos of urban combat. But the reality was that lines didn't exist in any conventional sense. Both sides held different buildings in the same villages. Control of territory was measured in city blocks or individual structures, and visibility remained poor. The fog hadn't lifted, smoke from burning buildings reduced visibility further, and darkness made coordinated movement nearly impossible. German commanders faced a decision: continue the direct assault through Krinkelt-Rocherath, or attempt to bypass the villages and find another route to Elsenborn. Bypassing would take time the offensive couldn't afford. The entire Ardennes operation was predicated on rapid breakthrough and exploitation before Allied reinforcements could arrive. Sitting outside Krinkelt-Rocherath while trying to find an alternate route would allow American forces to strengthen their positions on Elsenborn Ridge. So the decision was made to continue the assault. The 12th SS Panzer Division would attack in force on the morning of December 18th, using everything it had left: Panthers, Mark IVs, infantry, assault guns, to smash through American defenses and break out to the west. What the Germans didn't fully appreciate was how much damage American infantry had already inflicted on their armor. 21 tanks and assault guns destroyed on December 17th was a significant loss, but more concerning was the damage to German tactical cohesion. Tank crews that had seen Panthers and even Tigers knocked out by handheld rockets were now cautious, hesitant to advance without infantry support, reluctant to expose their flanks or rear. German infantry that had watched American bazooka teams engage tanks from suicidally close range understood that clearing buildings in these villages was going to be bloody, slow work. The attacking force on December 18th would be larger and better coordinated than the previous day's attacks, but it would also be more cautious, and in offensive operations, excessive caution is often fatal. December 18th dawned cold and foggy, visibility still limited to a few hundred yards. The German assault began around 8 o'clock hours with artillery preparation, high explosive and mortar fire pounding American positions in Krinkelt-Rocherath. The barrage lasted perhaps 20 minutes, enough to suppress some positions but not enough to destroy the defenders. Then the tanks came again, this time with much stronger infantry support, advancing in coordinated groups rather than columns. The 12th SS had learned from the previous day's mistakes, but so had the Americans. Bazooka teams that had survived December 17th now knew exactly where to position themselves for best effect. They'd identified which streets offered clear lanes of fire, which buildings provided cover and escape routes, which angles gave them shots at tank flanks and rear. The veterans, men like Soderman who'd successfully engaged armor and lived, passed this knowledge to less experienced soldiers. Ammunition was still scarce, but what they had was positioned where it would do the most good. And the American infantry now fighting in Krinkelt-Rocherath understood viscerally that they were holding the line not just for their own survival, but for thousands of soldiers withdrawing behind them. The fighting on December 18th exceeded even the previous day's intensity. German tanks and infantry pushed into both villages simultaneously, overwhelming some positions through sheer weight of numbers. American strongpoints held out in isolated buildings, calling artillery fire on their own positions when German infantry got too close. Bazooka teams continued engaging armor at ranges that would have been considered reckless under any other circumstances. One team reported firing at a King Tiger from less than 50 yards, a shot that struck the tank's lower glacis plate and failed to penetrate but damaged the running gear badly enough that the Tiger couldn't continue advancing. The crew abandoned the tank rather than sit immobile under artillery fire. The tactical calculus of bazooka versus heavy tank made a grim kind of sense in the context of Krinkelt-Rocherath. Yes, the bazooka was inadequate. Yes, most shots against frontal armor would fail to penetrate. Yes, firing at a tank meant exposing yourself to return fire that would kill you instantly if it connected. But the alternative was letting German armor move freely through the villages, destroying defensive positions, cutting off withdrawal routes, turning what remained of American forces into isolated pockets that could be reduced at leisure. Engaging the tanks, even with inadequate weapons, at least forced them to slow down, button up, become cautious, and occasionally, often enough to matter, those inadequate weapons got lucky. A rocket would hit a weak spot. A shaped charged jet would find a seam in the armor. An engine would catch fire. And another 45-ton or 70-ton symbol of German technological superiority would stop moving, start burning, and become one more obstacle blocking the roads through the twin villages. By mid-afternoon on December 18th, the 2nd Infantry Division had begun withdrawing the last elements from Krinkelt-Rocherath under heavy pressure. The villages couldn't be held indefinitely. The point had always been to delay German armor long enough to establish defenses on Elsenborn Ridge, and that objective had been achieved. Units still in contact with German forces conducted a fighting withdrawal, leapfrogging back through prepared positions while artillery fire kept German infantry at distance. The last American soldiers left Krinkelt-Rocherath around 4 p.m. on December 18th, leaving behind destroyed equipment, casualties that couldn't be evacuated, and 2 villages that had been fought over building by building for 2 days. German forces occupied Krinkelt-Rocherath on the evening of December 18th, but the victory was Pyrrhic. The 12th SS Panzer Division had suffered severe casualties in men and armor. Post-battle assessments and after-action reports indicate the division lost upwards of 40 tanks and assault guns in the 2-day battle. Numbers that varied depending on whose records you consult, but all agreeing the losses were substantial. German infantry casualties were heavy enough that multiple companies were combat ineffective. And critically, the delay at Krinkelt-Rocherath had given American forces time to establish strong defensive positions on Elsenborn Ridge. When the 12th SS Panzer Division attempted to continue the offensive westward on December 19th, it encountered prepared defenses with artillery support, anti-tank guns in depth, and infantry that had just demonstrated it could stop German armor with bazookas if necessary. The attacks on Elsenborn failed. The northern shoulder of the Ardennes offensive stalled, and the entire German operation began to unravel as American reinforcements arrived and counterattacks began. The tactical lessons from Krinkelt-Rocherath were clear, even if drawing those lessons required sifting through chaotic after-action reports and survivor accounts. First, handheld anti-tank weapons could be effective against heavy armor in close terrain if employed aggressively and at close range. The bazooka was never going to be a long-range tank destroyer, but in urban combat where engagement ranges collapsed to under 100 yards, it became viable if crews were willing to accept the risks. Second, armor without adequate infantry support was vulnerable even to light weapons. The Panthers and Tigers that the Germans threw at Krinkelt-Rocherath should have been nearly invincible. They became vulnerable because German infantry couldn't keep pace, couldn't clear buildings fast enough, couldn't protect the tanks from close-range ambush. Third, defensive operations in built-up terrain, favored the defender enormously if the defender was willing to fight at close quarters and had the weapons to damage enemy armor. These lessons were expensive. The 2nd Infantry Division's casualties for December 17th to 18th were severe. Hundreds dead, hundreds more wounded, entire units reduced to combat ineffectiveness. German losses were equally heavy, perhaps heavier considering the value of trained panzer crews and irreplaceable tanks. Both sides paid in blood for 2 villages that would change hands again before the war ended. For the individual soldiers who fought there, the battle was less about lessons and more about survival. William Soderman, evacuated with severe wounds on December 17th, would recover and receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. The citation would emphasize his repeated engagements with German armor, his willingness to take on tanks with weapons not designed for the task, and the critical time his actions bought for withdrawing American forces. He returned to civilian life after the war, the recipient of America's highest military decoration for doing what most people would consider suicidally stupid, charging German tanks with a bazooka. Lieutenant Jesse Morrow survived the battle and continued serving with the 38th Infantry Regiment. His improvised engagement of the Tiger tank with a bazooka grabbed from a destroyed Jeep became one of those battlefield moments that gets retold in unit histories. Not because it was textbook tactics, but because it exemplified the desperate innovation required when textbook tactics aren't available. Morrow's shot shouldn't have worked. The bazooka shouldn't have been able to damage a Tiger. But it did, because combat is full of moments where shouldn't doesn't matter, and what matters is what you do with the inadequate tools at hand. The bazooka teams who engaged German armor throughout the 2-day battle mostly remain anonymous. Unit records document the destruction of dozens of German tanks and assault guns, but often don't record who fired the critical shots. Some of these men survived and went home after the war. Others died in Krinkelt Rosherath or in subsequent fighting. What they accomplished, stopping a panzer division with handheld rockets fired at ranges that training explicitly said were too dangerous, stands as testament to what infantry can achieve with courage, desperation, and a willingness to violate every safety principle the weapons manual specified. The Battle of Krinkelt Rosherath didn't end the Ardennes offensive, but it helped ensure the offensive would fail. By holding the twin villages long enough to establish defenses on Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd Infantry Division anchored the northern shoulder of the American line. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which should have been exploiting breakthrough to the Meuse River, instead found itself exhausted and depleted, fighting for 2 small Belgian villages. The delay cascaded through the entire German operational plan. Other panzer divisions that should have been advancing westward found their routes blocked or delayed. American reinforcements arrived faster than German planners had anticipated. And within days, the Ardennes offensive that was supposed to split the Western Allies and force a negotiated peace had instead become a battle of attrition that Germany could not win. In retrospect, analyzing the tactical decisions at Krinkelt Rosherath reveals how desperation produces innovation. The bazooka wasn't supposed to engage heavy tanks. Infantry wasn't supposed to stand and fight armor in close terrain without anti-tank gun support. Soldiers weren't supposed to take shots that exposed them to immediate retaliation from 75mm and 88mm tank guns. But doctrine, like all plans, encounters friction when it meets reality. The reality at Krinkelt Rosherath was that American infantry had bazookas, German armor was coming through their positions, and withdrawal without fighting meant collapse. So they fought with what they had, took shots they weren't supposed to take, and discovered that sometimes the impossible shot works. The technical inadequacy of the bazooka against heavy armor was real, and remained real. The M1A1's shaped charge warhead struggled to penetrate Panther frontal armor and stood virtually no chance against a King Tiger from the front. But armor has weak points. Side plates are thinner than frontal armor. Rear engine compartments have ventilation grills that can be damaged. Tracks and running gear can be broken even by non-penetrating hits. And tank crews that know enemy infantry is close, armed, and willing to engage will become cautious, which in offensive operations translates to slower advance, which gives defenders time. The cumulative effect of dozens of bazooka teams taking desperate shots was to slow and disrupt German armor operations enough to buy the time American forces needed. What happened at Krinkult-Rocherath also illustrated something about the nature of defensive combat that's easy to miss in clean doctrinal analysis. Defenders don't need to destroy every enemy tank. They need to impose enough delay, friction, and casualties to disrupt the enemy's operational timeline. The 2nd Infantry Division didn't stop the 12th SS Panzer Division permanently. German forces eventually took the villages. But they delayed it for 2 days, costed dozens of tanks and hundreds of infantry, and ensured that when the 12th SS finally broke through, American defenses on Elsenborn Ridge were ready. Mission accomplished at terrible cost. The men who fought at Krinkult-Rocherath weren't superhuman. They were ordinary soldiers, infantrymen, NCOS, junior officers, who found themselves in an extraordinary situation and responded with whatever tools and tactics gave them a chance. Some of those tactics were brilliant improvisation. Some were desperate gambles that happened to work. And some were, by any rational standard, stupid. Taking on 70-ton tanks with 13-pound rocket launchers at point-blank range should not work. That it did work, repeatedly, says something about courage, something about the chaos of combat, and something about how doctrine and reality diverge under pressure. The aftermath of Krinkult-Rocherath saw both sides attempting to draw lessons. American after-action reports emphasize the effectiveness of bazookas in close terrain against armor when employed aggressively. This led to revised tactics for urban combat and increased emphasis on close-range anti-tank engagement in infantry training. The experience also accelerated development of improved bazooka designs. The 3.5-inch Super Bazooka that entered service late in the war offered better penetration and range, directly addressing deficiencies revealed in battles like Krinkult-Rocherath. German reports focused on the failures of armor infantry coordination and the vulnerabilities of tanks in close terrain without adequate support. But by December 1944, Germany lacked the resources to implement most lessons learned. For the historians examining this battle decades later, Krinkult-Rocherath represents one of those instances where tactical action and strategic outcome align clearly. What happened in those 2 villages over 48 hours in December 1944 directly influenced the course of the Battle of the Bulge, which directly influenced the timeline of Germany's defeat. You can draw a line from William Soderman's bazooka shots on December 17th to the establishment of defenses on Elsenborn Ridge, to the failure of the northern German offensive to the eventual Allied victory in the Ardennes. Individual actions mattered. Stupid, desperate, shouldn't-have-worked actions mattered. The question of whether those bazooka shots were actually stupid depends on how you define the term. Tactically, engaging heavy tanks with bazookas violated every principle of employment the weapons manual specified. From a survival standpoint, exposing yourself to fire from a Panther or Tiger to get a shot with a weapon that might not penetrate was objectively foolish. But strategically, those shots achieved critical objectives. They delayed German armor, disrupted their advance, bought time for American forces to establish stronger defensive positions. Stupid tactics that achieve strategic objectives stop being stupid and become desperate courage that happen to work. The legacy of Krinkult-Rocherath lives in military doctrine, in Medal of Honor citations, in unit histories of the 2nd Infantry Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division. It lives in the understanding that weapons don't have to be adequate to be effective if employed by soldiers willing to accept extraordinary risk. And it lives in the memory of men who faced the heaviest tanks ever built with handheld rockets and somehow won. Not because they were invincible, but because they were desperate, determined, and willing to take the shot even when every rational calculation said it wouldn't work. Sometimes that's enough. If you found this story worth your time, a like genuinely helps others discover it. Please subscribe and hit notifications. We're bringing these forgotten missions and the men who fought in them back into the light. Real stories, real people, no Hollywood exaggeration. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Belgium, Germany, and if someone in your family served in World War II, especially in the Ardennes, we'd be honored to hear about it. The soldiers at Krinkelt Rocherath demonstrated that courage, desperation, and inadequate weapons can sometimes achieve what overwhelming firepower cannot. Their actions deserve to be remembered accurately, and their story reminds us that in war, the impossible sometimes becomes possible through sheer determination. Thank you for listening and for keeping their memory alive.